Logan, you did the thing that's probably the toughest thing to do in this business, which is put out a mock draft. And it's up on the commander site now, isn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. On the commander site.
Yeah. So I didn't realize you were a sadistic to go out and do that, but I know it's part of the job. And actually,
It's not that I'm sadistic, John. It's that I'm stupid. I was like, they were like, you want to do a mock draft? I was like, oh, that sounds like so much fun. And then I started doing it. And I was like, this is way harder than I thought it was going to be. So
what part of it was harder? Like, what did you have to do? Because like everyone's like, oh, it doesn't matter. You always want to be right and you want to match up with what the needs are. So what did you have to do just to familiar or to educate yourself?
I think the most difficult thing was establishing your big board. And so what the big board is just kind of your sequence of players, right? And so it's hard enough to evaluate all the receivers against each other because they've all got a little skill set. They all got little different fits. But now how do I take that receiver group and then interweave them with defensive linemen, tight ends, offensive linemen, guards, centers? How do I determine positional value for each team with different positions? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Yeah. That was the thing that was most challenging because there's an offensive lineman that I love, right? But does he add more value to this team or to whatever team X, compared to this cornerback? And so determining that is really, really challenging. And then the more film you watch, the more you get the players fleshed out and the more you get to compare. And then, that's the other thing is kind of looking at other people's mock drafts and looking at other people's evaluations and comparing them to your own. It just is a very time intensive process, one that I really enjoyed, but it took a lot of time to get it hashed out.
And I'll say this, like you always studied this stuff before you were doing this. So it's not like you had to go, this was always something you've done very well anyway. And so who was the hardest guy in your top 10? Who were the ones, were there anybody that you struggled with a little bit more to place?
Yeah, I think the whole top 10 is a little bit down this year. I think so. Yes. The top 10 was really tough. The middle section of the draft actually picks 11 to 24 ish were pretty easy because they were good football players. It was kind of an embarrassment of riches in a lot of ways. And then the last third of the draft was really, really tough because this draft, like we've talked about before, is so dense. So instead of having a pool of 20 players or 30 players to fill 10 spots, now there's 50 players that could potentially fill those spots and could easily, just kind of whoever's picking, who if they like edge rusher, for example, in this draft is very, very deep. So a lot of people like George Karlaftis from Purdue. I don't like him as much. I don't think he's as physical in the run game. So I
wasn't as impressed by him.
Yeah, so I go with the kid from Penn State because I like him a little bit better. But I wouldn't be surprised in a second if Karlaftis went where the Penn State kid goes, or Boye Mafe goes there. A lot of people like his Senior Bowl. I don't like his college tape as much. Super impressive. But again, there's three guys that could easily be slotted at the same spot. And then that bumps people down, right? You slot somebody in at 22, the next edge rusher goes at 25, and all of a sudden one of those guys is the second round pick, and whoever's getting him in the second round feels really happy. So I think that's the thing about this draft that was so tough, bottom half. And then for the top 10, like you were saying, I think the guys that were really, really tough in there were the guys with that I've heard in talking with people in the NFL that had character issues, right? Kayvon Thibodeau, Derek Stingley, those guys make the draft impossible, right? Because obviously their film is very, very good. I'm not as high on Thibodeau's tape because I don't think he bends very well. And so it was easier for me to push him down. But when you hear stuff like that, because of the talent of Stingley, for example, he could go second overall if Detroit loves him, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then obviously the quarterbacks make that top half the top third very difficult because Carolina needs a quarterback, Atlanta needs a quarterback, New York maybe, right? And so if one of those teams picks a quarterback, it just kind of moves and shifts the whole draft and has an aftershock effect throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and that's always the hard part. Now, so you look at that because you also had Charles Cross going top 10, and I think he's one of those guys that kind of jumps in and out of that top 10, right?
Yes.
And then Jermaine Johnson, I've heard who you had going 10th.
Yeah.
I've heard good things about him for a while that people thought he'd be a top 10 guy, which always means someone's going to fall. But the last one on 2 in the top 10, you had Pickett going to Carolina, I think 6.
Yeah, 6. Yeah.
And I know this quarterback class, depends who you talk to, who they like first.
And I hated that. I hated having to do that. I don't think that's right. Like you talked about the big board, he's maybe a bottom first half, first half of the first round type guy. For me, But I think the thing about him that was tough is I look at Carolina, I'm like, what are they going to possibly do here, right? They don't have enough draft capital to trade for Jimmy Garoppolo necessarily this year. So maybe they package picks from next year and make that happen. I don't know if you're going to take a flyer on a former first-round quarterback in Baker Mayfield and try to bring them in after your kind of issue with Sam Darnold last year. And so I don't know. And Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield's openly said that he doesn't want to go to Carolina. So that's going to be a tough sell, I think. And so to me, what is their other alternative? And it's, I can't see a way around it. They need to draft somebody and they don't pick again until the 4th round. So it's not like they can get one of these like Desmond Ridder or, one of these other guys, Sam Howell. I'm not as high as on him, but, one of those kind of next tier guys, Adam Malik Willis and Pickett, right? The kind of the next group of guys in the 2nd round. Like they can't do that. They don't have that flexibility. So they're going to need to do something pretty drastic here. They could trade back, obviously, but again, no one's trading up with them because there's not an elite quarterback. And even like I've talked to guys around the league. So Neil, Aquanu, I love those guys. I like their tape a lot. Aquanu especially is fantastic. But I've talked to guys around the league and they say, oh, they're not as good as the guys from last year or the year before. So why am I going to trade up for them when I think they're kind of middle of the road, especially in an offensive line class that's super deep? Then you say, oh, well, what about the edge rushers, right? We've got, Trayvon Walker, we've got Jermaine Johnson. Why don't I trade for one of those guys? And then, but to me, the difference between those guys and the guys we just mentioned, Karlaftis, the kid from Penn State, the guy from Minnesota, I forget his name, but is not that big. So why are we going to mortgage draft capital to move up for a guy that we don't think is necessarily generational? So again, that's the thing with Carolina at 6 that makes me so frustrated. It's because I didn't want to make that pick, but I don't know from a team building standpoint how you go in any other direction because they don't have a quarterback that they feel good about going next season. So
for this team, you have a receiver there, and I'll be honest, it surprised me a little bit who it was. Jameson Williams. Jameson
Williams. Yeah, I think I'm probably going to catch a little bit of heat for this, but to me, like talking with my buddies around the NFL, talking with receiver coaches, like I had to trust my own evaluation here, right? One of the things I love about him is the thing I love most about him is probably the thing that people talk least about is his physicality, right? He's not a big man. He's like 6'1.5", like 190, I think he's listed at, but he blocks and he plays gunner. And we talked about, we've talked about receivers and their special team ability and why that's important because it shows tremendous toughness. And then I see him run routes. And for a guy that fast to have the level of nuance that he has, especially off of stems, not specifically like in terms of footwork at the top, but just in terms of stemming guys up, it's very high level. And to me, he's the most explosive offensive player in this draft. And if you want Scott Turner's offense to be this vertical passing attack, I can't think of a better, more suited player to get that done in terms of fit. Now, in my mock draft, I talk about the other guys. I talk about Devin Lloyd. I talk about Jordan Davis. I talk about Kyle Hamilton. I talk about Derek Stingley. I mentioned all of them and why I wouldn't be surprised in a second if they went that way. I just think for this team, that Jameson Williams upside is something that you can't overstate. And it's really exciting because he's maybe the top 5 fastest guy in the NFL. And he plays with a physicality and you see his passion for when he plays that the Ohio State guys don't necessarily show. And that's why I push those guys down a little bit on my list.
And with Williams, who obviously started off sitting behind Wilson Olave, but it wasn't that they, I think even the coaches there would say the kid can play, but how are you going to bench these guys? Well, he'll be there in 2 years and then suddenly he transfers and he blossoms in a big way, which is not surprising because you saw flashes of talent even there. The other thing too, like he's got that ability to run away from people. So on those shallow, it's not just the deep stuff. It's those shallow crossers, which you can really, really use to your advantage.
And I know you've talked about Olave before. And one of the things that kind of differentiate, again, you're looking for anything to differentiate these guys because they're all good football players, really, right? You're looking for any little thing. And so one of the things I loved about Williams is on the crossing routes, when he catches a ball, like he's a punt returner and he's not afraid. And he's running with a physical mindset to like score touchdowns. And Olave has a tendency, at least in the film that I watched, obviously there's a lot of film out there, a lot of games, to kind of turtle up and I don't want to say give himself up, but again, like which player would I prefer? It's the guy that's running with a violent mindset to score touchdowns, and when I talk to receiving coaches, unprompted, that information comes up. And so I do think that Jameson Williams, of the people that I spoke to, and again, that's a very specific tree of people, value that skill set a little bit more than the other guys. And I have him at 2 because of the ACL, but a lot of guys I spoke to said he was their favorite receiver in the class. Now, these are coaches, right? So a little different evaluation process, but I think that's important to understand here.
Well, and that's the other thing I was going to ask too, because the ACL is a factor for teams, and it may be for this team too. But the funny thing is, if he doesn't have the ACL, he's not even in discussion at 11.
Right. Yeah.
On before 11. So, and that's the thing that we don't know is where our team's going to grade that. And like I said, I think here it's a factor, but I think the proof will be on that night. If he pops up there and he's not there, then it is the knee.
And I say this in my mock draft, it's a factor for me too. I just look at what he would bring from a potential standpoint, not necessarily this year, but like I really think he's the guy that has the biggest upside in terms of being an explosive, game-changing type player. And that to me is worth taking a little bit of a risk on, obviously.
They like size, and I think they want size. That means Drake London.
Yep.
You obviously went this way. What do you think of him? And we've talked about him too. And like, there's sometimes, well, what do you think? I don't care what I think.
Well, I love everything about his tape. I love the way he competes. I love his physicality. I love his short area quickness. I love all of that stuff, right? I don't think he's like a true X receiver necessarily. I think people see those measurables and they say, oh, he's a true X. I know you had a guy on your podcast last week who said that. I would disagree with that assessment. I think he's kind of a move piece. I think he's like, like Marcus Colston comes to mind.
I've heard that name a few times with him.
Yeah, like Larry Fitzgerald-esque, kind of like he's a more athletic tight end is what I visualize him. Like my comp for him is Jordan Reed. Like he's got that nice double stick quickness, that basketball ability. I think he high points the football better than Jordan. He's kind of always open because of his size. I really, 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 really wanted him to run his 40-yard dash. I really wanted him to run because I wanted to know what his vertical speed is. Because when I watch the tape, I'm a little bit concerned about it, right? How do you separate against elite NFL coverage guys? Pac-10 talent pool is a little down. I had a couple conversations with guys around the NFL who said Pac-12 guys, always freak me out because the level of competition. I just don't trust it. I just don't trust my evaluation. I don't trust the game tape. And so that was another thing that came up quite a bit. I like him a lot. I love that he blocks. I love his physicality on finishes. I love how he competes for the football in the air. Like he is a Logan Paulsen football player, right? But in terms of translating that skill, that was another thing that was tough about the draft is you look at a college player and the college game is different than the NFL game, right? And so how do I take this skill set in college and translate it to this kind of different element in the NFL?
When you look at him, and we talked before about Carson Wentz and the accuracy or can be a little bit off here, and here. One thing you see with Drake London is that ability to adjust in the air. Yeah. And how, if they go that way, can that be a benefit to them? And does that offset some other things?
It's funny when we asked me about that, whenever that was last week, we did that. I was thinking about Drake London. I was like, well, he'd actually be a pretty good fit for that Carson Wentz skill set. Yeah. So, maybe, obviously like that's the other thing about the mock draft. You're always going back and kind of making little edits and changing stuff. But I do think, of the receivers that are going in that top group, he's got that skill set. He's the guy to do that. So again, like on my mock draft on the Commanders website, like I put him in there and he's in there. He's in the discussion for me at 11. And I think he would be a nice fit here. And I wouldn't be upset. I just have more reservation about his skill set translating the NFL because I'm not sure about his top end speed. Again, love the short area quickness. Right. He's got it's high level, competing for the air, high level, all that stuff's great.
And for a guy his size to have that short area quickness, I think is different. But it's funny that you brought up Jordan Reed because there are a couple of times where I'm watching them play, and you pointed this out to me, I think a month ago or so. But there was some clips I was watching of him where he's basically almost lined up, almost like an H-back.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and he ran this route. My first thought was that looks like Jordan, but now he's a faster version of Jordan.
Yeah, right.
But it looked stylistically, it looked like Jordan,
which is valuable. Is it? But the question is that valuable at 11? And is he fit this offense? Which wants to kind of be a little bit more vertical as opposed to horizontal. I think moving into 2022.
Are there other big receivers? Let's say they don't get Jameson 11. Yeah. Are there other big receivers that you like after the first round that, whether it's an Alec Pierce or something like that, you say, like, you don't have to get size here. Because I know, like, in Scott Turner's offense, we always hear that size is important at some level. So they want to get that if you can. So who after the first round would you say you don't have to get Drake London here because you can get this guy here?
Yeah, I think this was tough for me too, because I think that's one of the reasons Drake London's value is so high this year, is because they're, you kind of classify your speed receiver, your do-it-all receiver, your big receiver, and the list of big receiver is not very long. And after I'd say like the first three guys, it's not great, which is a little bit why I think people are pushing him up, because his value is going to be really high this year because he's got a very unique skill set. You mentioned Alec Pierce, I like his film a lot. In some ways I kept having this weird AJ Brown comp in my head, and it's not the same player because he's not the same after the catch, obviously. But in terms of just being bigger and stronger than everybody, it shows up a lot on tape. He's got a 40-inch vertical and he's 6'3". He's got long arms, and then when he jumps for the football, it looks like he's jumping off a trampoline. So obviously that is really exciting. And in my later rounds, I kind of mentioned if you want to take a flyer on someone with a really high upside from a physical standpoint, Alec Pierce is definitely there. And he's not overly physical as a blocker, but he gets it done. The guy that I think is probably the most interesting, especially for this team, was Christian Watson. I know everyone's talking about him, but he's 6'4.5", 6'5". And when you watch his tape, again, level of competition is not great, but when you watch his tape, the first time I watched it, I think I told you this, I thought I left the tape on fast forward because that's how fast he looked. He's this big, he's got this long stride. He's an explosive playmaker. So I love him and I love his upside, but again, very, very raw. Struggled a little bit with press at the Senior Bowl, the physicality element of the game, but a guy that, I haven't talked to a lot of teams about him yet because he wasn't going to go in the first round, at least in my mind. But again, those are the two guys that I would keep an eye on. The problem is I guess you could take him at 47. I think a lot of people feel like they're going to be off. Alec Pierce will be there. Alec Pierce feels more like a late second, early third kind of guy.
Right. And they don't have a third round.
Right. So I think that's the issue with him. But again, I like both of them quite a bit. And I think either one of them would make this football team better.
So, and Kyle Hamilton was sitting there too. And you mentioned Buffalo nickel. We've talked about that a lot. And what are your thoughts on him? And again, it's a spot they want to fill.
Yeah.
So you don't get him. Where are you looking?
So this really isn't an indictment of Kyle Hamilton. I have some questions about him. I think he's a little tight in the hips. It's so funny. Before he even ran, I know a lot of people don't feel this way. I had questions about his top end speed. I just like the way his foot interacts with the ground. It gives me questions. And then now compound that with how he ran. Again, I don't think that's the strength of his game anyway. I think he's really high level anticipator. I think he does a good job just playing football. But there's a little bit of concern about how that translates. But again, his vertical jump, his broad jump, all those things kind of make you think that he's got the explosive tools to kind of run better when he needs to run better. But I think the thing about him and the Buffalo nickel position is I felt like there were other guys that I liked more for that role when they were picking at 47. So Jaquan Brisker is one guy that comes to mind. Right. He's a very physical football player. He reminds me a lot of Landon when I see him, the way he fits runs, he's not afraid. Great tackler, defeats blocks well, and has, I think, better coverage ability, at least right now, than Landon does. So that to me, and I think he might not be available at 47, which makes it a little bit risky not to take Kyle Hamilton there. But I think he fits that Buffalo nickel role a little bit better. And then Petrie out of Baylor is a guy that I like a lot as
I know you talked about him before.
Just a football player. He is a guy. And then Hill out of Michigan is another guy because the reason I like them is because I think they have better natural man coverage ability than Kyle Hamilton. And I think they also have a nice physicality when it comes to fitting runs. So you just get better athletes on the football field. And again, that's not an indictment of Kyle Hamilton because I think he'd be great in that role. But there's three guys I just mentioned who might be there when you're picking at 47. And they fill that role and they'd add another coverage element that Kyle Hamilton doesn't have.
And I also think it's important. I do think they need to add another element to that offense at receiver. So I think whether it's somebody who's a game breaker or whether it's the Drake Londons or whatever, I think it'd be good to get that. Yeah. But again, then what do you think you can get in round two? And then the other thing too, offensive line.
Yeah.
So you're looking at that spot because as we talked before, needing a guard, or are there any tackles where you'd say, I'd be tempted to take this tackle and shift Cosme to guard, and which would be the best option here?
Right. So
and I'm not even advocating that. I'm just saying, but that is, if they got a tackle they really liked.
And I think that's not an indictment of Cosme. Like, in some
No.
ways, I think that's an endorsement of Cosme, because I think he's that good of a football player. You just want him on the field, and
Right.
you're going to get the guy you draft and put him in where you need to. And he played a little bit of guard at Texas, you know, so he's got a good skill set for it. Okay, so in terms of tackle, I talked to one of my buddies, and he was telling me that he felt this tackle class was a little bit weak. Like, he said he thinks Ekwonu is probably a guard. This is his opinion, obviously, and I don't disagree with that because he's a little tight-hipped. Neal might be best at guard, which is crazy to think about because he's so dang big. But again, those are top two. I had a guy who told me that they're not even evaluating Penning as a tackle, they're evaluating him as a guard. So if he were to slip, you know, maybe you put him in at guard, right? The other guy that I think is probably most exciting of anybody in this class, and I don't think that many people are talking about him, is Tyler Smith from Tulsa. Every single O-line coach I've talked to, they just perk up when you hear his name. And it's because he's got position flexibility. He's big. Johnny, if you haven't watched his tape, it's maybe the rawest tape you've ever seen.
I have not.
He's all over the place, doesn't use his hands well. He just is like this gigantic dancing bear of a human that I think you can plug and play at guard right now. And especially with Matsko as your coach, that's a guy you say to yourself, that guy under that kind of tutelage is going to be perfect for this scheme because he's big. He had the highest graded big elite blocks by PFF. So like knockdown blocks, pancakes, physical finishes of any player in the country this last year. But he looks like he's playing high school football. He just hasn't been coached. But a lot of people like the athleticism. They like that the physicality, and they like that he is willing to learn. And so I think that that's an interesting guy who might, because of the technical deficiencies and just the raw, the lack of football knowledge. He's a sophomore coming out of Tulsa, redshirt sophomore. So if he were to slip to 47, like, I would jump all over that. And then the other thing that's kind of crazy is after that, tackle gets a little sparse. You know what I mean? Like, it's not great. So one guy that comes to mind, a guy that I like a lot, and when I talk to guys around the NFL, they like him too. They're a little bit worried about his demeanor in terms of being like high energy, low energy kind of guy. He's not very excitable, which makes some guys nervous because, like, how passionate are you about football? Is Daniel Falele out of Minnesota?
Oh, okay.
He gets a lot of comps to Orlando Brown, who, you know, obviously a team just traded a first-round pick for. Obviously, he's only been playing football for 4 years and hasn't been playing a ton, but has gotten better each year. And I think when I watch him against elite competition, Ohio State, Purdue, I just see a guy, and it screams to me, the offensive lineman outside of Tyler Smith with the most potential in the draft, who will probably be there when they're picking in the second round. Okay. I think he's probably more of a late second, early third because he didn't test very well at his pro day. But again, like, when you watch the film, man, like, you're just like, this guy, he's got 35.5-inch arms. He's 6'9", he's 380. When he gets his hands on people, it's awesome. But the thing that I love most about him is his pass protection. So there's that. There's a kid from not North Dakota State, Wachowski, something like that. He's 6'9", 310, a little bit better athlete. I like him a lot. He'll be available later, but I think a guy that could maybe be a swing tackle to start that you develop. But again, after that first round of guys, the consensus is that it's not ultra deep. There are some guys with some high upside that you like, but there's some pieces you got to move around, and a lot of developmental guys.
Last two more things. I appreciate your time as always.
Yep.
Just give me one or two tight ends maybe to watch later, because again, we know that there could be. Is there one or two that you'd say after the 5th round or so that maybe pay attention to? I know that Jelani Woods is not going to be. He's really good, but like, I don't think he's going to be there for them.
Yeah, Jelani's one of my favorites. He's a guy that I work with personally, so like, I'm really biased there. I like him quite a bit. Obviously, Greg Dulcich, another guy I work with out of UCLA, probably not going to be there in the 5th round. Charlie Cronar out of Iowa State is 6'6.5". He got 35.5-inch arms, 34.5-inch arms, which is like tackle length arms. You got good understanding of the pass game, more of a Y in terms of physical traits, I would say. But and I don't think he's gonna slip that far. I think he's probably a 4th round guy. Otten out of UW is a guy that comes to mind in terms of a guy that has tremendous upside, was hurt at UW, but every single person I've talked to has been like, oh, you should check out this Otten guy. You should check out this Otten guy. And I haven't had time to yet, but the buzz around him and the potential I think is conducive. And the fact he's coming off an injury means he might slide a little bit. So Otton out of UW is interesting. And I'm trying to think if there's anybody else that struck my fancy. Obviously, I think the kid from Ohio State, who you're familiar with, is probably going to be out of there in the 3rd or 4th round. But yeah, I think there will be some guys later. It's just about, they all have their warts this year, you know, like they didn't run as well as they thought. They're not as big as people thought. And I think those are things that make people nervous about this class.
Last thing, you went through this process, 2010, undrafted guy. Yeah. Do you have a favorite memory from throughout the process, whether it was you weren't drafted? So whether it was when you signed or, you know, what was that whole experience like? Or is there anything, you know, that pops that you look back on from that entire experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wasn't expecting to get drafted, but I did get a couple calls from teams in the draft saying, "Oh, we're going to draft you. We're going to draft you." And I think when the draft finished, I had a lot of teams call me and want me to be a part of their organization, you know, which was very flattering at the time. And I think the call, when I got the call, and like I was kind of in between Washington and San Diego at the time, which is near where I grew up. I was really torn, but I, you know, knew the tight end coach here at the time, and I knew a couple guys on the team here, which was exciting for me. Chris Horton was a guy that was always really cool to me at UCLA, and
rising coach.
Yeah, rising coach, exactly. He might be head ball coach at UCLA here before you know it. Anyway, and when I finally said yes, you know, and I got a call from the strength coach afterwards, and the administrative stuff kind of started happening, that was probably the coolest part for me, because I had no expectation of, you know, being in the NFL. And so even though I thought I was just going for like a off-season program, basically, to kind of have that process started and be talking to NFL guys, talking to the staff, that was really exciting for me. And then the first flight out, obviously, like, and, you know, you shake people's hands when you're in the building, meet all the other rookies. Like, it just was a really, I mean, you can hear it in my voice. It was just a really cool experience and so unexpected. And it led me to this like crazy journey that I've been on the last, you know, 12 years. So
now doing mock drafts. Go check it out on commanders.com. Logan, thanks a lot.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it, John.
Hey, everybody, it's John Keim. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and I'll continue to bring you guests who provide excellent insight into the Washington Commanders. And while you're here, check out the other terrific content on the Ampire Media Network, including Inside the Cap with Joel Corey and All's Caps with Steve Wino and former Washington Capital Carl Alsner. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thank you.